It is 1931, the depths of the Great Depression. Unemployment is at 25%. The country is broke, demoralized, and politically convulsed. And the United States government is building the largest dam in the world. Thousands of men pour into the Nevada desert and set up a city of tents and wooden barracks in temperatures that reach 120 degrees. They drill into canyon walls with handheld pneumatic hammers. They lower themselves on ropes from cliff faces to set dynamite charges. They pour concrete in shifts around the clock, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, for years. Men die, over 100 of them by official count, and the work does not stop. The Hoover Dam is finished in 1936, 2 years ahead of schedule. It is 726 feet tall. It holds back the entire Colorado River. It generates enough electricity to power a city of 750,000 homes. It was, when completed, the largest hydroelectric power station on Earth, the largest concrete structure ever built, and the highest dam ever constructed. And it was done in the middle of the worst economic crisis in American history in 5 years. Now consider that a 3-mile tunnel in Boston took 16 years and cost $24 billion. Consider that California's high-speed rail line, announced in 2008, has still not moved a single passenger. Something changed. This is what changed. Tell me in the comments what you think broke first. If you have ever stood at the base of the Hoover Dam, or walked across the Golden Gate Bridge, or looked up at the Empire State Building from the sidewalk, you know the particular feeling those things produce. It is not just aesthetic pleasure, it is something closer to disbelief, a sense that human beings actually did this, with their hands, with machines that seem almost quaint by today's standards, in time frames that feel impossible from the vantage point of the present. The Golden Gate Bridge, 4 years, finished under budget. The Empire State Building, 14 months, from breaking ground to the top floor, 14 months. The Interstate Highway System, 47,000 miles of divided highway built across a continent over roughly 30 years, for a cost, in today's dollars, of about $500 billion. Today, a single interchange in a mid-sized American city can cost $1 billion and take a decade. You stand at these things and feel the gap between what America once did and what it does now. Not the gap in technology, which has only improved. The gap in will, in speed, in institutional capacity. The gap between a country that built things and a country that plans to build things endlessly, expensively, and sometimes never. Before we mourn, let's be precise about what made the old speed possible, because some of it was not admirable, and understanding that is part of understanding what changed. The Hoover Dam was built fast, partly because the workers who built it had almost no rights. They worked in lethal heat with minimal safety equipment. The company that built it, Six Companies Inc., was repeatedly fined for safety violations it simply paid and ignored. Workers who complained could be replaced instantly from the line of desperate men waiting outside the gate. The interstate highway system was built fast partly because it bulldozed through existing communities, black neighborhoods in particular, without meaningful consultation, compensation, or recourse. Entire city districts were erased. The people in them were told to move, and if they could not afford to, they were moved anyway. The Apollo program was built fast partly because it operated under wartime secrecy and military authority, with procurement rules suspended and congressional oversight bypassed. Speed, in that era, was purchased with things we have since decided we are not willing to sell. The question, the genuinely hard question at the heart of this story, is whether the reforms that followed went exactly as far as justice required, or whether they went further. The list of what America built between 1930 and 1970 reads like a challenge to disbelief. The Hoover Dam, 1936. The Golden Gate Bridge, 1937. LaGuardia Airport, 1939. The Pentagon, the largest office building in the world, built in 16 months during wartime, 1943. The entire Manhattan Project, the research, the factories, the cities built from nothing to house the workers, the bomb itself, in 3 years. The Interstate Highway System, begun 1956. NASA's entire space program infrastructure, built from scratch. The World Trade Center towers, 1972 and 1973. The Trans-Alaska Pipeline, 800 miles of pipe across wilderness, completed in 3 years. These were not small projects. They were not simple projects. They were projects that required solving engineering problems that had never been solved before, coordinating thousands of workers and dozens of contractors across years and miles, and moving mountains of material across landscapes that barely had roads. And then, somewhere in the 1970s, the pace slowed, and it never recovered. The 1970s were the decade that rewired the legal architecture of American construction, and they did so for reasons that were, at the time, almost entirely correct. The National Environmental Policy Act was passed in 1969, effective 1970. It required that any major federal project produce an environmental impact statement, a document assessing the effect of the project on the surrounding environment, before construction could begin. This was a direct response to genuine disasters, rivers that caught fire from industrial pollution, highways that destroyed ecosystems, dams that wiped out species. The Clean Air Act of 1970, the Clean Water Act of 1972, the Endangered Species Act of 1973. Each of these created new legal grounds on which a project could be challenged, slowed, or stopped. And alongside these laws grew the doctrine of legal standing, the expanding ability of individuals and organizations to sue the government over projects they opposed, not just because the projects harmed them personally, but because the projects violated procedural requirements. You no longer needed to be injured to file a lawsuit. You needed only to show that the government had not followed its own rules. The environment needed protection. The reforms were right, but the mechanism they created had consequences nobody planned for. To understand why things take so long and cost so much now, you have to follow the money and the calendar separately, because they tell different stories. The calendar story runs through lawyers and courts. Every major infrastructure project in America today faces an environmental impact statement that can run to thousands of pages and take years to produce. Once produced, it can be challenged in federal court by any party with legal standing: neighbors, environmental groups, competing businesses, local governments, and those challenges trigger their own review processes, their own appeals, their own delays. The Big Dig in Boston was in legal and planning processes for nearly 20 years before a shovel touched dirt. The money story runs through procurement and labor. American construction costs have grown at roughly twice the rate of inflation for 50 years. Union work rules, prevailing wage laws, and contractor liability requirements add cost that is largely invisible until you compare the price of the same project built in America versus in a peer country. A mile of subway in New York costs on average nearly $2 billion. The same mile in Paris costs $200 million. The same mile in Madrid costs $80 million. To understand how America got here, you need to understand one man who never held elected office and whose name most Americans do not know, and who built more of New York City than any mayor or governor in history. Robert Moses held power in New York from the 1930s to the 1960s through a network of public authorities, legal structures, that allowed him to issue bonds, hire workers, and build things without direct democratic oversight. He was never elected to anything. He was appointed, repeatedly, to positions that gave him effective control over parks, highways, bridges, tunnels, and housing across the region. He built an enormous amount, and he destroyed an enormous amount. Neighborhoods, communities, ecosystems, the social fabric of entire boroughs, without consulting, compensating, or even adequately warning the people in his way. The backlash against Moses was the backlash against the whole model, the unaccountable builder with a blank check and an army of lawyers. When he was finally removed from power in 1968, a new era of oversight, consultation, and legal protection began. That era was necessary. It was also, as it turned out, the beginning of the end of American megaprojects. The numbers, when you put them next to each other, produce a kind of vertigo. The Empire State Building, in today's dollars, cost roughly $500 million and took 14 months to build. One World Trade Center, built on the same island with a century of additional engineering knowledge, modern machinery, and a 21st century supply chain, cost $4 billion and took 12 years from groundbreaking to opening. California's high-speed rail project was approved by voters in 2008 with a projected cost of $33 billion and a completion date of 2020. The current projected cost is $128 billion. The current projected completion date is sometime in the 2030s for a partial system. The full system, connecting Los Angeles to San Francisco as originally promised, has no credible completion date. The Gateway Tunnel Project, a new rail tunnel connecting New Jersey to New York, replacing infrastructure that dates to 1910, has been in planning and political negotiation since the early 2000s. Construction has not yet started. The country that built the Hoover Dam in 5 years has spent 20 years discussing a tunnel. Built at roughly the same time in two peer democracies with comparable labor costs and regulatory environments. In 2012, Paris began extending its metro system with the Grand Paris Express, 68 new stations, 200 kilometers of new track, an entirely new automated network running beneath one of the densest cities in Europe. Cost? Approximately 40 billion euros. Projected completion? 2030. On schedule. In 2007, New York City began extending the 2nd Avenue subway, 3 new stations, 2 miles of track on a corridor that had been planned since 1919. Cost $6 billion for the first phase alone. The second phase, 4 more stations, is currently projected to cost another $6 billion, taken till 2029 and faces regular schedule slippage. 2 miles, $6 billion, a century in the planning. Paris built a network. New York built 2 miles and a moral injury. These are not different countries with different values. They are different institutional systems producing different outcomes. And the gap between them is not natural, not inevitable, and not permanent, unless we decide to stop asking why it exists. At roughly the same time, in two peer democracies with comparable labor costs and regulatory environments. In 2012, Paris began extending its metro system with the Grand Paris Express, 68 new stations, 200 kilometers of new track, an entirely new automated network running beneath one of the densest cities in Europe. Cost? Approximately 40 billion euros. Projected completion? 2030. On schedule. In 2007, New York City began extending the 2nd Avenue subway, 3 new stations, 2 miles of track on a corridor that had been planned since 1919. Cost? $6 billion for the first phase alone. The second phase, 4 more stations, is currently projected to cost another $6 billion, take until 2029 and faces regular schedule slippage. 2 miles, $6 billion, a century in the planning. Paris built a network. New York built 2 miles and the moral injury. These are not different countries with different values. They are different institutional systems producing different outcomes. And the gap between them is not natural, not inevitable, and not permanent, unless we decide to stop asking why it exists. Here is the honest answer, stated without the comfort of a single villain. America does not have a construction problem. It has a process problem. The engineering knowledge exists. The workforce exists. The money, when it is appropriated, exists. What does not exist is a streamlined, accountable, time-limited process for moving from decision to construction without a decade of legal, environmental, and political friction in between. Every layer of that friction was added because projects were destroying ecosystems. Public consultation was added because communities were being bulldozed. Procurement rules were added because contractors were defrauding the public. Labor protections were added because workers were dying. Each reform was a response to a real abuse. The problem is that the reforms accumulated without any corresponding mechanism for resolving them efficiently. The result is a process that protects against every abuse of the past while making it nearly impossible to build anything in the present. You cannot fix this by removing the protections. You can only fix it by building institutions capable of honoring the protections and building things at the same time. That is a harder problem. America has not solved it. The revealing thing is that other wealthy democracies, countries with strong unions, strong environmental protections, and strong legal systems, do not have this problem to anything like the same degree. Japan built infrastructure at extraordinary speed and at a fraction of American costs, inside a legal and regulatory system that is, if anything, more procedurally complex than America's. The difference is institutional. Japan has agencies with genuine technical expertise, stable long-term funding, and procurement systems that reward on-time delivery rather than change orders and litigation. Spain, which built its high-speed rail network from almost nothing in the 1990s and 2000s to the longest in Europe, did so with environmental review, public consultation, and democratic oversight, and completed projects in timeframes that American counterparts have not approached. South Korea built its entire high-speed rail network in under 8 years. These countries did not skip the process. They built institutions capable of running the process efficiently. The difference is not the law. The difference is the capacity to execute the law without being paralyzed by it. The debate about why America does not build is usually framed as a question about money spent on projects that fail or overrun. That framing misses the deeper cost, the cost of not building at all. The Brent Spence Bridge, the main highway crossing between Cincinnati and Kentucky, has been functionally obsolete and officially structurally deficient since 1998. It carries more than twice the traffic it was designed for. A replacement has been in planning since the early 2000s. Construction has not yet begun. Amtrak's Northeast Corridor, the busiest passenger rail corridor in the Western Hemisphere, runs on infrastructure built largely in the 1930s. Trains routinely slow to speeds of 15 miles per hour at aging segments. The corridor carries 52 million passengers a year on equipment that was new when Eisenhower was president. New York's water tunnels, the aqueducts that supply drinking water to 8 million people, were built in 1917 and 1936. City engineers have known for decades that inspecting them requires shutting them down, and that shutting them down might cause them to fail, so they have not been inspected. The price of not building is not visible in any headline. It accumulates in deferred maintenance, in economic drag, in the slow grinding cost of a country running on infrastructure from another era. The picture is not entirely bleak, and the exceptions are instructive. The Transbay Transit Center in San Francisco, a complex multimodal transit hub built in the middle of one of the most expensive and legally complex jurisdictions in the country, came in essentially on budget and on time. The reason, according to everyone who worked on it, a single accountable authority with real power, a fixed deadline, and a procurement structure that penalized delay. Denver International Airport, when it was built in the early 1990s, was massively over budget and over schedule, a disaster by any measure. But it got built, and it has since handled the growth of one of America's fastest growing cities. The lesson Denver's planners drew from the experience shaped the generation of more disciplined project management in the region. The Tappan Zee Bridge replacement in New York, now the Governor Mario M. Cuomo Bridge, was completed in 2018 after a procurement process specifically designed to compress the timeline by running design and construction in parallel rather than sequentially. These exceptions share a single feature. Someone with authority made finishing the project more important than avoiding every possible criticism along the way. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act of 2021 appropriated over $1 trillion for American infrastructure. Roads, bridges, rail, broadband, water systems. It was the largest federal infrastructure investment in decades, and the announcement was accompanied by precisely the kind of optimism that large numbers tend to produce. And some of it is moving. Projects are being funded, contracts are being awarded, construction is beginning on things that have been waiting for money for a generation. But money, it turns out, is not the binding constraint. The binding constraint is the process. The same reviews, the same litigation risks, the same procurement timelines, the same institutional fragmentation that made projects slow and expensive before 2021 are still in place in 2024. Money poured into a broken process produces expensive, slow projects. It does not fix the process. The country that once built the Hoover Dam is now, in some meaningful sense, a country that is very good at funding studies about building things. The studies are thorough, the consultations are extensive, the environmental reviews are comprehensive, and the infrastructure is aging, quietly, under all of it. There was a time when America built things that should have been impossible. It built them in deserts and on ocean bays and across mountain ranges. It built them in depressions and wars and with tools that we would today consider primitive. It built them fast, sometimes carelessly, sometimes at terrible human cost. And it knew, even then, that some of the cost was too high. So it reformed. It added protections for workers, for communities, for the environment. It gave citizens the right to challenge projects that would harm them. It demanded accountability from the builders and the funders and the governments that commissioned the work. These reforms were right. They were necessary. They were, in the deepest sense, civilization advancing. But civilization also requires that things get built. Bridges need to cross rivers. Tunnels need to go under cities. Trains need to move people from where they are to where they need to be. And a legal and institutional system so complex, so fragmented, so designed to prevent any single abuse that it prevents all construction, that system is not protecting people. It is failing them in a different way, more slowly, more expensively, and without a clear villain to hold responsible. The country that built the Hoover Dam in 5 years is not gone. The engineers are here. The workers are here. The money, when it comes, is here. What is missing is the institutional will to finish, to say that this project at this time matters enough to move through the friction and the lawsuits and the reviews and the politics and simply be built. We built harder things. We just decided, somewhere along the way, that deciding to build was enough. It was not enough. It is not enough. Subscribe, because the next story on the workbench is about another thing America built and then forgot how to maintain.